My father weighed us every morning and locked women in empty rooms for gaining even half a pound. So I taught everyone to manipulate their weight with wrestling tricks until he discovered our secret and tried to force us into treatment facilities. That's when things really got crazy. In my house, women got weighed every morning at 6 a.m. sharp. If you gained even half a pound, you were locked in the empty bedroom without food until you lost it. My mom spent 3 days in there once because she retained water during her period. When she came out, her lips were cracked and she could barely stand. But she smiled and thanked my father for helping her stay beautiful. I was just 8 years old at the time, and I thought that's just how life was. So by the time I turned 15, I'd seen my sister pass out twice, my cousins sneaking water from the bathroom tap, and my aunt teaching her daughter to make herself throw up after family dinners. The men would eat full plates while we picked at salads, calculating every bite. The rules were simple. Step on the scale every morning in front of your father or husband. If the number went up, you went to the room. No exceptions, no excuses. Except, of course, for pregnancy. But even then, you had 6 weeks after birth to get back to your marriage weight, or you'd be sent back to the room. And one day, I was graced with something beautiful. Not pregnancy, it was a hobby. Wrestling. Because it was wrestling season at school. And that's when I had my light bulb moment. Watched boys dropping 5 pounds overnight for weigh-ins using water manipulation. They'd dehydrate before weighing, then rehydrate after. It was dangerous, but it was temporary. I became obsessed with weight manipulation techniques. Caffeine pills as diuretics helps you pee more. The exact timing of water intake. How to drop 3 pounds overnight and gain it back by noon without anyone noticing. But I couldn't keep this to myself. Not when my 12-year-old cousin was crying with hunger every day. Not when my sister was losing her hair from malnutrition. So I started a sewing circle every Thursday afternoon, teaching the girls in my family to embroider. Except between the stitches, I taught them other things. How to use natural diuretics the night before weigh-ins. How to wake up at 4 a.m. to sweat in garbage bags, then shower before the 6 a.m. weigh-in. How to use those hydration packets to put into your water afterwards. We got scientific about it, tracking our cycles to know when we'd retain water, taking measurements to prove we weren't actually gaining fat even if the scale fluctuated. Some girls learned to manipulate their weight by 5 pounds in either direction, eating full meals while still hitting their morning numbers, all to avoid the room. But I taught them something else too, how to document everything. I showed them how to take photos of the scale readings, how to record the sound of locks clicking, how to hide phones in the punishment room. We kept medical records showing the dangerous dehydration cycles we were forcing on our bodies. 6 months into our sewing circle, everything fell apart. I'd taught the girls to reprogram digital scales using magnets, making them read 5 pounds lighter. It was supposed to be foolproof. We'd all been eating normally for weeks while our fathers praised our discipline. But my uncle bought a new scale, a mechanical one, old-fashioned, no electronics to hack. That morning, every woman in the house was 5 pounds over. The men went insane. They thought we'd coordinated some kind of rebellion. As they dragged girl after girl to the punishment rooms, they had to use bedrooms, closets, the basement, because there weren't enough official rooms. My 13-year-old cousin started screaming, "We haven't gained weight. We've been faking the numbers. We've been eating this whole time." She pulled out her phone showing months of documentation, real weights versus manipulated ones, the scale hacking tutorials, everything. The room went silent. My uncle's face turned purple as he scrolled through her phone. Screenshots of our group chat, videos of us teaching each other to reprogram scales, time-stamped photos showing girls eating full dinners while their morning weigh-ins showed losses. "You poisonous little..." He raised his hand to strike her, but that's when we heard the sirens. My cousin smiled through her tears. "I've been live streaming for the past 10 minutes. The police rushed through our front door, their radios crackling with codes I didn't understand. My uncle dropped his hand, stepping back from my cousin as officers spread throughout the house. One officer, a woman with kind eyes, knelt beside my cousin who was still clutching her phone with shaking hands. "Everyone needs to separate into different rooms," the lead officer announced. "We'll be conducting individual interviews." My father's face shifted from shock to calculation. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "Officers, this is clearly a misunderstanding. We run a health-conscious household. These girls are being dramatic about simple dietary guidelines." The other fathers nodded quickly, falling into line behind his lead. My uncle added, "We encourage healthy eating habits, nothing more." But the officers weren't buying it. They'd seen the live stream. They'd heard the screaming. Within an hour, Child Protective Services arrived arrived with a team of social workers. They set up in our living room, creating makeshift interview spaces with portable dividers. I watched from the kitchen as they led my younger cousins away one by one. Each girl clutched the documentation we'd been collecting, phones full of evidence. My sister went in looking pale but determined. When she came out 40 minutes later, the social worker's face was grim. The fathers huddled in the dining room with their phones, making frantic calls. By evening, a lawyer arrived, expensive suit and leather briefcase, announcing his presence before he even spoke. He gathered the men in my father's study, and we could hear their muffled voices through the walls. Over the next few days, our house became a war zone of legal strategy. The lawyer coached the fathers on exactly what to say. The empty bedrooms weren't punishment spaces, they claimed. They were voluntary timeout rooms for meditation and prayer. The girls could leave anytime they wanted, they insisted. The locks were just for privacy. My uncle became the enforcer of their new narrative. He started showing up at our schools, catching girls alone by their lockers. My 14-year-old cousin found a note in her backpack. Remember, family stays together. Smart girls know when to stay quiet. He cornered my sister outside her chemistry class. Maya's already gone, he told her, sent to stay with relatives who'll help her understand the importance of family loyalty. You want to join her? The threat worked on some. 3 girls from our sewing circle stopped coming to school altogether. Their mothers kept them home, telling anyone who asked that they were too traumatized by the false accusations to face their peers. But the real blow came when I tried to access our cloud storage. Months of carefully organized evidence, gone. Every photo, every video, every documented weight chart had vanished. I knew immediately who was responsible. I found Brad in his room, staring at his computer screen. My older brother had always been the tech genius of the family, the one who fixed our phones and set up our secret group chats. Now he couldn't meet my eyes. Dad made me do it, he said quietly. He knew about the cloud backup, threatened to cut off my college funding. The prosecutor called a meeting with the remaining girls. She looked tired, stress lines creasing her forehead. Without Maya's testimony and with the digital evidence destroyed, this case is getting weaker. The defense is painting this as a cultural misunderstanding about strict parenting. That's when I remembered the phones. In my early days of teaching the girls, I'd shown them how to hide old phones in the punishment rooms. Phones that could record audio, that could capture the reality of being locked away. Some of those phones might still be there. The opportunity came during my cousin's wedding. The whole family would be at the venue, including my uncle. His house would be empty. I told my mother I felt sick and needed to stay home. She barely glanced at me, too focused on maintaining appearances at the celebration. I drove to my uncle's house with my heart pounding. The spare key was still under the fake rock where it had always been. Inside, I went straight to the punishment room, a converted bedroom with locks on the outside. I pried open the heating vent where I'd shown his daughter to hide things. 3 phones, all still recording, though 2 had died. The third had maybe 10% battery left. I plugged it into my portable charger and started scrolling through the files. Hours of audio, girls crying, locks clicking, and then gold. My uncle's voice clear as day. I know locking them up is technically kidnapping, but sometimes you have to break small laws to maintain important traditions. These girls need to learn discipline. What are you doing here? I spun around. David stood in the doorway, my 17-year-old cousin who'd been tasked with checking on the house. My uncle's son, trained to be the next generation of enforcer. I clutched the phone, ready to run, but David closed the door behind him and leaned against it. I've been waiting for someone to find those. I stared at him, confused. He pulled out his own phone, showing me a folder labeled Insurance. I'm gay, he said simply. Have been hiding it for 3 years. I know what it's like to be trapped by family traditions. I've been recording everything. Dad's conversations, the lawyer's coaching sessions, all of it. We spent the next hour transferring files, creating multiple backups. David had recordings of his father admitting to destroying evidence, of the lawyer explaining how to manipulate the system, of the fathers discussing how to pressure the girls into silence. Why didn't you come forward before? I asked. Same reason you taught the girls to manipulate scales instead of calling the police, he replied. We were all trying to survive within the system before we were ready to destroy it. The trial moved forward with our new evidence. The defense tried their cultural differences argument, painting the fathers as well-meaning traditionalists who simply had different ideas about health and discipline. They brought in experts who testified about various cultural approaches to weight management and family structure. But then something unexpected happened. My mother asked to testify. She stood in that courtroom, thin thin and fragile, and spoke for the first time about decades of abuse, about the pregnancies where she'd been locked away for gaining too much weight, about the times she'd fainted from dehydration but been told she was being dramatic, about watching her daughters suffer the same fate and feeling powerless to stop it. Her testimony opened floodgates. One by one, aunts who'd been silent started speaking up. They talked about years of starvation, of being locked away for normal body changes, of being taught their only value was in numbers on a scale. The judge's decision was swift. Systematic abuse, false imprisonment, child endangerment. The sentences ranged from 6 months to 2 years, with my uncle getting the longest term for his intimidation tactics. My mother filed for divorce the day after the verdict. The house became ours, and she turned the punishment room into a library. Words have power, she told me. We're filling this room with better ones. The sewing circle evolved into an official support group. We met every Thursday at the community center, teaching practical skills while processing trauma. New girls joined, some from similar situations, others just needing a safe space to exist in their bodies without judgment. I threw myself into school, grades improving now that I wasn't spending every night planning weight manipulation strategies. A women's rights organization heard about our case and offered me a scholarship to study law. I accepted immediately, knowing exactly what kind of lawyer I wanted to become. The letters from prison started arriving 6 months later, my father's handwriting on envelope after envelope. I developed a ritual, burning them unopened in the fireplace that had once warmed the house he'd turned into a prison. The smoke carried away words I didn't need to read. 2 years later, I was grocery shopping near campus when I saw him. He'd been released early for good behavior and looked different. Thinner, older, worn down by his time inside. He started walking toward me, his mouth opening to speak. I pulled out my phone, holding it up between us, ready to record whatever he might say. He stopped, understanding the message. We stood there for a moment, former father and daughter, now strangers separated by everything he'd done. Then he turned and walked away. These days, I work with girls trapped in similar situations. Not as a lawyer yet, still finishing school, but as someone who understands. I teach them the same things I taught my cousins, but with a different ending. Document everything, yes. Protect yourself, absolutely. But also know that there's a way out that doesn't involve hiding and manipulating. There are people who will believe you, systems that can help, futures that don't involve scales and locked doors. The sewing circle still meets every Thursday. My mother runs it now, teaching actual embroidery alongside lessons in recovery and self-worth. Sometimes I stop by when I'm home from school, watching new faces learn to create something beautiful with their hands while their bodies heal from years of punishment. My sister gained 20 pounds and kept it on. She smiles now, really smiles. Not the brittle expression we all perfected for morning weigh-ins. My cousins are in therapy, some still struggling, but all of them free to eat when they're hungry and rest when they're tired. And me? I'm learning that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about prevention, education, and changing systems that allow abuse to flourish in silence. Every girl I help escape, every family I educate about the difference between health and control, every future lawyer I inspire to take on these cases, they're all stitches in a larger pattern. The scale in our house sits in the garage now, gathering dust. We thought about throwing it away but decided to keep it as a reminder, not of weight or control or morning terrors, but of survival and resistance, and the day we finally said enough. My phone buzzes with a text from David. He's in law school too now. Different university, but same mission. We compare notes on cases, share resources for survivors, plan the legal practice we'll open together someday. Two cousins who found alliance in unexpected places, working to make sure no child has to choose between family and freedom. The punishment rooms are gone, transformed into spaces of healing and growth. But the lessons remain, not the ones our fathers tried to teach about control and compliance, but the ones we taught ourselves about resistance and recovery. Every Thursday, in community centers and living rooms across the city, our story continues. One stitch, one girl, one freed voice at a time. The next morning, my phone rang at 5:47 a.m. My mother's voice trembled through the speaker. They changed the weigh-in time. Your father just called all the men. They're coming here at 6:30 instead. I bolted upright, my heart racing. This was exactly the kind of manipulation we'd feared. By randomizing the schedule, they were trying to catch us unprepared, to prove we'd been cheating the system. I sent out a mass text to our group chat, warning everyone about the time change. Within minutes, responses flooded in. Girls were panicking, some already halfway through their morning hydration routine. Others had eaten late the night before, counting on having more time to process. My 16-year-old cousin Margie texted that she'd just finished a full glass of water. Garbage bags, I typed quickly. Everyone who needs to drop weight, get in the shower now, turn it hot, sweat it out. The house erupted into controlled chaos. Bathroom doors slammed. Showers ran at full heat. I helped my sister wrap herself in plastic bags under her clothes, then cranked up the heater in her room. We had less than 40 minutes to undo 8 hours of normal eating and drinking. My mother moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale but determined. She'd lost 2 pounds in the 3 days since the police visit, stress eating away at her already thin frame. But this morning, she helped us without question, bringing towels and checking on each girl's progress. At 6:25, we assembled in the living room, hair still damp from showers, faces flushed from heat, but weights where they needed to be. The men arrived exactly at 6:30, my father leading the group with a new digital scale under his arm. "We've decided morning weigh-ins need more flexibility," he announced, setting up the scale with deliberate slowness. "Healthy habits shouldn't be predictable. From now on, we'll vary the times." My uncle nodded, his eyes scanning our faces. "And we'll be using different scales each day to ensure accuracy." One by one, we stepped forward. The numbers appeared, and each girl passed. But I noticed my father making notes in a small notebook, recording not just weights but observations. Who looked tired, who seemed nervous, who had wet hair. After the men left, we collapsed in the living room. My cousin Margie was shaking, dehydrated from the rapid weight loss. My sister's lips had a bluish tinge. We'd won this round, but at what cost? "This isn't sustainable," my mother said quietly. She looked at each of us, her eyes filled with something I'd never seen before: anger. "They're going to keep changing the rules until someone gets seriously hurt." She was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the psychological warfare intensified. Weigh-ins happened at random times, sometimes twice a day. Different scales appeared each time, some reading heavier than others. The fathers started requiring us to weigh in wearing specific clothes, adding unpredictable variables. But it was the school visits that broke us. I was in calculus when the office called me down. My uncle waited in the counselor's office, wearing his best suit and his most concerned expression. The counselor, Mrs. Peterson, looked uncomfortable. "Your uncle is worried about your recent behavior," she said carefully. "He says you've been spreading lies about your family." My uncle leaned forward, his voice dripping with false concern. "We're just trying to help her, Mrs. Peterson. This rebellion against healthy eating. We think she might have an eating disorder, the opposite kind. She's encouraging other girls to overeat." I sat frozen, realizing the trap. If I defended myself, I'd sound like I was in denial. If I stayed silent, it looked like admission. Mrs. Peterson glanced between us, clearly unsure who to believe. "We'd like to get her help," my uncle continued. "There's a wonderful treatment facility that specializes in these issues. Very discreet, very effective." The threat was clear: comply or be sent away like Maya. That afternoon, I found my sister crying in the bathroom. She showed me a note that had been slipped into her locker. "Maya misses her family. Don't make the same mistake." 3 more girls from our sewing circle disappeared that week. Not sent away, but pulled from school by their mothers. Homeschooling, the official story went. But we knew better. They were being isolated, cut off from support systems. The breaking point came when I discovered Brad's betrayal went deeper than just deleting files. I'd noticed him acting strangely, always on his laptop, always closing screens when I walked by. One evening, while he was at basketball practice, I snuck into his room. His laptop was password protected, but I knew his patterns. His password was always variations of the same theme. What I found made my stomach turn. Folders within folders of our communications. Screenshots of every text, every group chat message, every piece of advice I'd given about weight manipulation. But worse were the notes he'd added. Analysis of our patterns, predictions about our next moves. All dated after he'd supposedly deleted everything for Dad. He'd been spying on us the entire time. I heard the front door open and quickly closed the laptop. But when Brad walked into his room and saw me at his desk, he knew. "How long?" I asked. He couldn't meet my eyes. since the beginning. Dad knew you'd try to rebuild the evidence. He wanted to stay ahead of it, and you just went along with it? You don't understand, Brad said, his voice cracking. He has my whole future mapped out. Pre-med at his alma mater, his connections for residency. Everything I've worked for depends on his support. Everything you've worked for is built on our suffering. I shot back. Brad slumped onto his bed. I know. I hate myself for it, but I can't lose everything I've worked for. That's when I noticed something. A folder on his desktop labeled insurance, the same word David had used. You kept copies, I said slowly. You're playing both sides. Brad's face went pale. Get out of my room. But I'd seen enough. My brother, the betrayer, was also hedging his bets. Somewhere in that laptop was evidence he'd kept for himself, just in case. The next Thursday, only 4 girls showed up to our sewing circle. The community center felt cavernous with so few of us. We sat in a small circle, pretending to embroider while discussing our dwindling options. Maybe we should stop, suggested Peggy, my youngest cousin at just 11. My mom says we're tearing the family apart. The family was already torn, I replied. We're just making the tears visible. That's when Margaret, one of the newer girls, spoke up. My neighbor's daughter went through something similar, not with weight, but with control. She said the key was finding adults outside the family who would listen. We'd tried that with the police and CPS, but the father's lawyer had been too effective. We needed a different approach. What about teachers? My sister suggested. Or doctors? The school nurse, I said suddenly. She's mandatory reporter. If we could get medical documentation of the dehydration, the malnutrition. It was risky. The fathers had already painted us as liars and rebels, but medical evidence would be harder to dismiss. We spent the rest of the session planning. Each girl would visit the school nurse separately, complaining of symptoms, dizziness, fatigue, irregular periods, all true consequences of our forced weight cycling. We'd build a paper trail that couldn't be deleted or destroyed. But the fathers were watching us more closely than we realized. The next morning, I woke to find my mother sitting on my bed, her face drawn with worry. Your father knows about the nurse visits, she said. Someone told him. He's pulling you and your sister out of school. He's already called to withdraw you. My mind raced. Without school, we'd lose access to the nurse, to counselors, to any outside adults who might help. We'd be as isolated as the other girls who'd been pulled out. Mom, I said urgently, you have to stop him. She shook her head. I can't. You know I can't. Yes, you can, I insisted. You're our mother. You have rights. Rights I gave up long ago, she whispered. But something in her eyes had changed. The anger I'd seen weeks ago had evolved into something else. Determination, maybe. Or desperation. That afternoon, while my father was at work, my mother did something unprecedented. She drove us to school herself. If he asks, you snuck out, she said, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. I couldn't stop you. It was a small rebellion, but it was hers. At school, I went straight to the nurse's office. Mrs. Chen looked up from her desk, concern creasing her features when she saw my face. I need help, I said simply, and then I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I'll need to file a report, she said finally. But given the previous CPS investigation, I want to document everything thoroughly first. Can you bring me medical evidence? Photos of the weight charts? Anything concrete? I thought of the phones hidden in my uncle's house, of Brad's secret folders, of David's recordings. Evidence existed, but accessing it felt impossible. I'll try, I promised. That evening, the confrontation was explosive. My father had discovered our school attendance. He stood in the living room, face purple with rage, while my mother cowered on the couch. You deliberately defied me, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Both of you. My sister and I stood together, drawing strength from each other's presence. Behind my father, Brad watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. We went to school, I said. That's not a crime. In this house, my word is law, my father replied. And you've broken that law for the last time. He pointed to the hallway. Both of you. To your rooms. You'll stay there until you remember what obedience means. I felt my mother tense beside us. This was different from the punishment room. This was imprisonment in our own bedrooms, a new evolution of control. No, my mother said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at her. She stood slowly, placing herself herself between us and my father. "No," she repeated louder this time. "They're going to school. They're going to eat. They're going to live." My father's face cycled through emotions: shock, rage, disbelief. "You forget your place." "I remember it perfectly," my mother replied, "and I'm done." The silence stretched between them, years of oppression and submission crackling in the air. Then my father did something that changed everything. He raised his hand, not to strike, but to point, to command, to reassert control through the threat of violence that had always lurked beneath the surface. Brad moved before any of us could react. He stepped between our parents, his laptop clutched in his hands. "I have everything," he said quietly. "Every conversation, every locked door, every pound lost and gained, every girl who cried, every threat made, everything." My father froze. "You wouldn't." "I already did," Brad replied. "Copies sent to my cloud, to David's cloud, to 3 separate email accounts. You touch any of them, and it all goes public." The laptop screen showed folder after folder of evidence. Not just what he'd collected for my father, but what he'd collected against him. Screenshots of text messages between the fathers planning their legal strategy, recordings of the lawyer coaching them to lie, financial records showing payments to relatives who took in the banished girls. "You're my son," my father said, his voice breaking. "And they're your daughters," Brad replied. "But you only remembered that when it served your control." The standoff lasted seconds that felt like hours. Then my father turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. We heard his car start and drive away. My mother sank onto the couch, shaking. Brad set down the laptop and sat beside her, both of them processing what had just happened. "Why now?" I asked him. Brad looked at me with exhausted eyes. "Because I realized I was becoming him, and that scared me more than losing medical school." Over the next few days, our house existed in a strange limbo. My father didn't return, though his clothes remained in the closet. The morning weigh-ins stopped. We ate meals without calculating, slept without fear of surprise measurements. But the other families continued their routines. We heard from cousins still trapped in the cycle. My uncle had tightened restrictions, implementing new rules to prevent another uprising. The community center banned our sewing circle, citing family disputes they didn't want to get involved in. David texted me updates from inside his father's house. The paranoia was increasing. The men met nightly, planning legal strategies and discussing damage control. They'd hired a public relations consultant to help reshape the narrative. "They're going to claim religious persecution," David warned. "Say their traditional values are under attack." It was a smart strategy. Reframe abuse as culture. Paint themselves as victims of modern society's assault on family values. Make us the aggressors destroying sacred traditions. The school nurse called me back to her office. She'd filed her report, but warned me the investigation would be complicated by the previous case. "They're likely to see this as family conflict rather than abuse," she explained, "especially with your father's lawyer involved." I thought of Maya, silenced and sent away, of the girls pulled from school, of my mother, finally standing up only to face an uncertain future. The system that should protect us was being manipulated by those who knew how to work it. That's when Margaret's words echoed back to me, adults outside the family who would listen. But maybe we'd been thinking too small. What if it wasn't just one family? I asked Mrs. Chen. What if there were others? Other girls, other families, same patterns? Her eyes sharpened. That would change things. Pattern evidence is much harder to dismiss. I left her office with a new mission: find others, build a network beyond our family, create evidence of systematic abuse that couldn't be explained away as cultural differences or family disputes. The search started small: quiet conversations with classmates, careful questions in online forums. Slowly, stories emerged, not always about weight, but about control. Families where food was weaponized, where bodies were monitored, where punishment came through starvation or forced consumption. Within 2 weeks, I'd connected with 6 girls from different families. Their stories varied in details, but shared the same core: control disguised as care, abuse wrapped in concern for health or beauty or tradition. We met in secret, not at the community center, but in a park after school. No sewing circle pretense, just truth-telling. One girl's family used food rewards and punishments to control behavior. Another's insisted on daily body measurements, not weight, but dimensions, punishing any expansion. "We need to document everything," I told them, sharing what I'd learned: medical records, photos, audio, build cases that can't be dismissed. But even as we organized, the resistance intensified. My uncle appeared at our house one evening when my mother was alone. phone. I came home to find her crying in the kitchen, a bruise forming on her wrist where he'd grabbed her. He said I'm destroying the family, she whispered, that I'll regret choosing corruption over tradition. I photographed her wrist, adding it to our growing documentation, but I knew threats were escalating beyond words. The next day at school, 3 men waited by my car, not fathers from our family, but from the other families I'd been connecting with. Word had spread about my organizing. You're interfering in private family matters, one said. That needs to stop. I held up my phone, already recording. Is that a threat? They exchanged glances and walked away, but the message was clear. We weren't just fighting our own fathers anymore. We'd triggered a broader resistance from families who saw our rebellion as a threat to their own control systems. Brad found me that night in my room, laptop in hand. I've been tracking their communications, he said. They're organizing too, sharing strategies, legal resources, even discussing sending more girls away. He showed me screenshots of a group chat between fathers from different families. The network we'd feared existed. Men united not by culture or tradition, but by the desire to maintain control over the women in their families. There's something else, Brad said, pulling up another folder. Financial records. They're pooling money for legal defense and for something called rehabilitation facilities. My blood ran cold. Not just sending girls to relatives anymore, actual facilities designed to break rebellion and enforce compliance. We need to move faster, I said, but fast meant risky, and risky meant dangerous. The plan came together over 3 intense days. David would gather final evidence from inside his father's house during Sunday dinner, when everyone would be distracted. Brad would compile everything into organized files with backups across multiple platforms. The other girls would get their medical documentation completed, and I would return to my uncle's house for the phones. This time, I wouldn't go alone. Margaret volunteered to come with me, along with her older brother Theodore, who had his own history with family control. He'd broken free at 18, but understood the cost. Sunday arrived gray and drizzling. My mother hugged me before I left, whispering prayers I'd never heard her speak before. She'd grown stronger in the weeks since standing up to my father, but fear still shadowed her eyes. My uncle's house sat quiet in the rain. The spare key was gone, but Theodore had learned things in his years of resistance. The back window lock had always been faulty, and within minutes we were inside. The punishment room felt smaller than I remembered, maybe because I was seeing it with clearer eyes, not just as a space of control, but as evidence of systematic abuse. I went straight to the heating vent while Margaret kept watch, and Theodore documented everything with his phone. The screws were tighter than before, painted over. Someone had been here. My heart sank, but I kept working, using Theodore's pocket knife to chip away paint and loosen screws. Finally, the vent cover came free, empty. The phones were gone. Check other vents, Theodore suggested. If they found one hiding spot, you might have moved them. We spread out, checking every vent, every loose floorboard, every possible hiding place. In the 3rd bedroom, Margaret found something. Not phones, but papers. Medical records from a rehabilitation facility in another state. Treatment plans for oppositional defiance disorder and family disruption syndrome. Made-up diagnoses for girls who refused to comply. Maya's name was on one of the forms. I photographed everything, my hands shaking. This was bigger than we'd imagined. Not just family control, but an entire system designed to pathologize resistance. Someone's coming, Theodore hissed from the hallway. Car doors slammed outside, multiple vehicles. We'd been set up. Back window, I said, shoving the papers back into the vent. Go. But as we reached the back of the house, flashlight beams cut through the rain outside. We were surrounded. They knew, Margaret whispered. Someone told them. My mind raced through possibilities. Who knew about today's plan? Only our closest circle. David, Brad, my mother, my sister. The front door opened. Footsteps entered the house. Not rushed or angry, but confident. They knew we were trapped. I know you're here, my uncle's voice called out. Your cousin David told us everything. Poor boy finally came to his senses about family loyalty. My heart shattered. David, who understood oppression. David, who'd shared his own secrets. David, who'd been our strongest ally. He's lying, Theodore whispered. Classic manipulation. Turn us against each other. But doubt crept in. How else would they know exactly when we'd be here? lawyer. You have two choices, my uncle continued. Come out now and we handle this as a family matter, or we call the police for breaking and entering. Your choice. Theodore grabbed my arm. Third option, he whispered. We go loud. Before I could ask what he meant, he pulled out his phone and went live on social media. We're trapped in a house where girls are locked up for gaining weight, he said to the camera. They're surrounding us because we tried to gather evidence of abuse. This is happening right now. The effect was immediate. My uncle's confident voice faltered. Footsteps rushed toward our location, but Theodore kept filming, narrating everything as flashlights found us through windows. 3 teenagers trying to expose family abuse, he continued. And look how many adults it takes to stop us. The back door burst open. My uncle stood there, face twisted with rage. Behind him, other men from various families, but also behind them, neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Turn that off, my uncle demanded. No, Theodore replied, keeping the camera steady. Let everyone see what protecting family honor really looks like. For a moment, nobody moved. Then we heard sirens in the distance. Multiple vehicles. Someone had called 911 about the live stream. My uncle's face cycled through calculations. The neighbors watching, the live stream recording, the sirens approaching. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in real time. This isn't over, he said finally, stepping aside. We walked past him, Theodore still filming. Margaret gripped my hand as we passed the gathered men. Some looked angry, others worried. A few seemed to be reconsidering their positions as neighbors filmed with their own phones. The police arrived as we reached the street, not to arrest us, but to respond to concerns about child welfare from viewers of the live stream. The tables had turned, but I knew this was just one battle in a longer war. As we gave our statements to the officers, I saw David arrive with his mother. His face was stricken, tears streaming. He shook his head at me, mouthing, I didn't tell. I wanted to believe him. But trust, once broken in families like ours, was hard to rebuild. The investigation that followed was different from the first one. Theodore's live stream had gone viral, bringing attention no lawyer could easily dismiss. Other girls from other families started speaking up, emboldened by seeing they weren't alone. My mother filed for divorce the next week, not quietly, but publicly, citing years of abuse and control. Other mothers followed, creating a cascade of families restructuring, but the fathers regrouped. The rehabilitation facilities still existed. Girls were still being sent away. The system of control had been exposed, but not destroyed. Brad gave all his evidence to the investigators and prosecutors. His medical school dreams were over, our father's support withdrawn. But he seemed lighter, freed from the weight of complicity. I'm switching to social work, he told me. Maybe I can help kids trapped like we were. The sewing circle reformed, but differently. No more hiding. We met openly at the library, teaching practical skills while building a support network for anyone escaping family control. Some days were harder than others. My father contested the divorce, using every legal tool available. My uncle spread rumors about us through the community. Some extended family cut us off entirely, choosing tradition over truth, but we persisted. Each girl who joined our circle was another voice. Each mother who chose her children over compliance was another crack in the foundation of control. Maya never came back. We learned she'd been placed with relatives who supported the family system, but she managed to send word through a friend of a friend. Still fighting, still surviving. Don't stop. We didn't stop. The investigation expanded. More families were exposed. The rehabilitation facilities faced scrutiny. Slowly, painfully, systems of control were being challenged, but the biggest change was in us. We'd learned our bodies belonged to us. Our choices were our own. Our voices, once silenced by scales and locked doors, could speak truth to power. The war wasn't over. It might never be truly over. But every Thursday, in libraries and community centers, in living rooms and online forums, we gathered, teaching, supporting, surviving, building a world where no girl would have to choose between family and freedom. And sometimes, late at night, I'd get texts from unknown numbers. Girls I'd never met saying, I saw your story. I need help. And I'd respond, because that's what we do. We reach back and pull others forward, one voice at a time, until the chorus drowns out the silence. The police took our statements while neighbors continued filming from their driveways. My uncle's face remained twisted with fury as officers questioned him about the locked rooms. Theodore's live stream had reached thousands of viewers, and more police units arrived as concerned calls flooded in. David approached me while the officers were busy. His hands shook as he showed me his phone screen. Text messages from his father threatening to expose his sexuality if he didn't reveal our plans. The timestamp showed they'd been sent an hour before we'd arrived at the house. I deleted them from the group chat, he said, voice cracking. Told them you'd changed your mind, but they must have had someone watching the house anyway. I wanted to be angry, but I understood. We'd all made impossible choices trying to survive in these families. David had protected us the only way he knew how, by misdirecting rather than betraying. The officers separated us for individual questioning. The female officer who interviewed me took detailed notes about the punishment rooms, the forced weigh-ins, the systematic starvation. She asked specific questions about dates, times, witnesses. This wasn't like the first investigation. They were building a real case. Margaret's brother Theodore had to surrender his phone as evidence, but not before the live stream had been saved and shared across multiple platforms. Within hours, other girls from other cities started sharing similar stories. The hashtag Scales and Locks began trending. My mother arrived at the scene, having received frantic calls from relatives. She walked past my uncle without acknowledging him, wrapping me in a fierce hug. Behind her, Brad parked his car and jogged over, laptop bag slung over his shoulder. I've been monitoring their group chat, he said quietly. They're planning to file charges against you for breaking and entering, but I have screenshots of them discussing the punishment rooms from months ago. Clear admissions of guilt. The police released us after 2 hours of questioning, but not before serving my uncle with a warrant to search his house. We watched from across the street as officers documented the locks on the outside of bedroom doors, photographed the punishment room, and collected the papers from the heating vent. That night, our house felt different. My father still hadn't returned, but his presence lingered in every room. My mother moved through the space like she was reclaiming territory, opening windows, rearranging furniture, throwing away the scale that had controlled our lives for so long. The next morning brought a cascade of consequences. 3 more families reported similar abuse after seeing Theodore's live stream. The rehabilitation facility mentioned in the papers faced an emergency inspection. My father's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter about the defamatory social media posts. But we had momentum now. Mrs. Chen, the school nurse, coordinated with nurses from other schools who'd noticed similar patterns. They compiled medical records showing consistent signs of malnutrition and dehydration among girls from specific families. The pattern evidence I'd hoped for was materializing. Brad spent days organizing all the digital evidence into a comprehensive timeline. He created encrypted backups and distributed them to trusted allies, David, Theodore, Margaret, and 2 journalists who'd reached out after the live stream went viral. If anyone tried to destroy evidence again, copies would survive. The father's response was swift and coordinated. They hired a public relations firm that began pushing stories about concerned parents being vilified for promoting healthy lifestyles. They found a few doctors willing to speak about the obesity epidemic and the importance of parental guidance in nutrition. My uncle appeared on a local morning show, presenting himself as a caring father whose daughter had been influenced by social media trends promoting unhealthy body images. He spoke eloquently about tradition, family values, and the dangers of government overreach into parenting decisions. But for every media appearance they made, survivors responded with their own stories. A woman in her 30s shared photos from her teenage years, hollow cheeks, thinning hair, the telltale signs of long-term starvation. She'd escaped her family at 18 but still struggled with food 20 years later. The investigation intensified when Maya's aunt contacted the police. She'd been caring for Maya in another state and was horrified to learn the real reason for the girl's arrival. She drove Maya back to testify, defying threats from the family network. Maya looked smaller than I remembered, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted being locked in the punishment room for days at a time. She showed investigators photos she'd managed to take inside the room, scratch marks on the walls, a bucket in the corner, the view from a window too high to reach. The prosecutor assembled a strong case, but warned us the defense would be aggressive. The fathers had deep pockets and connections throughout the community. Several judges recused themselves due to personal relationships with the accused families. During this time, our support group grew. We met twice a week now, no longer hiding our purpose. Mothers started attending with their daughters. Some came in secret, still living with controlling husbands but desperate for connection and hope. One evening, a woman appeared at our meeting with her 3 daughters. She looked around nervously before speaking. "My husband doesn't know we're here, but I saw the live stream. We need help." Her oldest daughter, maybe 14, lifted her sleeve to show bruises from where she'd been grabbed and dragged to their punishment room. The youngest, barely 10, hadn't spoken in weeks since her last confinement. We connected them with resources: lawyers who worked pro bono, safe houses for women leaving abusive situations, therapists who understood trauma from systematic control. Our network had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I first taught my cousins to manipulate scales. The trial date approached amid continued intimidation attempts. Dead animals appeared on our doorstep. Our car tires were slashed twice. Brad installed security cameras after someone spray-painted "liars" across our garage door. But we also received support from unexpected places. A group of male survivors reached out, sharing their own stories of being forced to meet impossible physical standards by controlling fathers. They understood the weight of family expectations, the way love could be weaponized through conditional approval. Theodore started a companion support group for young men escaping controlling families. He partnered with David, who had finally come out to his mother and found her surprisingly supportive. Together, they created resources for LGBTQ+ youth trapped in abusive family structures. The week before the trial, my father finally resurfaced. He didn't come to the house but sent messages through his lawyer. He wanted to reconcile, to work things out as a family. The lawyer stressed that criminal proceedings would tear the family apart permanently. My mother laughed bitterly when she read the letter. She'd gained 15 pounds since he'd left and looked healthier than she had in years. "He tore us apart the first time he locked me in that room," she said, feeding the letter into our fireplace. Then came the security footage. A grocery store near my uncle's house had cameras that captured our arrival and departure on the day of the break-in. But more importantly, it showed my uncle and 5 other men arriving 20 minutes before us, clearly lying in wait. The prosecutor added conspiracy charges. The evidence showed they'd planned to trap us, to create a scenario where we'd look like criminals. Their lawyer argued it was a misunderstanding, that they'd simply been protecting private property. But the messages Brad had saved told a different story. 2 days before the trial, Peggy's mother reached out. My youngest cousin had been hospitalized for severe dehydration after her father implemented even stricter weight controls. She was 11 years old and weighed less than she had at 9. Her mother was ready to testify. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. Supporters filled one side while the father's allies occupied the other. Media lined the back wall, cameras ready to capture every moment. The judge had allowed limited recording due to public interest. My mother testified first, her voice steady as she described decades of abuse disguised as care. She brought medical records showing hospitalizations for exhaustion that were really starvation, photos documenting her physical deterioration during punishment periods. Maya followed, stronger now with her aunt's support. She detailed the transportation across state lines, the threats used to keep her silent, the conditions in the punishment room. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity, a child describing torture as if it were normal. When the defense cross-examined, they tried to paint us as rebellious teenagers influenced by body positivity extremism. They suggested we'd exaggerated normal parental discipline into something sinister. They brought their own experts who testified about reasonable parental authority. But then the recordings from the hidden phones were played. My uncle's voice filled the courtroom, admitting he knew the imprisonment was illegal, but necessary for maintaining order. Other fathers could be heard discussing how to circumvent child welfare laws while maintaining control. The security footage from the grocery store destroyed their claim of protecting property. Enhanced audio caught my uncle saying, "When we catch them inside, we'll make sure they never interfere again." The conspiracy was undeniable. Brad testified about the pressure to delete evidence, showing emails where our father threatened not just his education funding, but his future career prospects. He'd kept everything, creating a clear trail of obstruction and witness tampering. The defense made a final attempt to frame this as cultural tradition being attacked by modern values. They brought in anthropologists who testified about various cultural practices around food and family structure. But the prosecutor countered with experts on abuse, who explained how control mechanisms operate across all cultures. On the final day of testimony, something unexpected happened. One of the fathers broke ranks. Peggy's father stood up during a recess and asked to speak with the prosecutor. His daughter's hospitalization had shaken something loose. He offered to testify in exchange for a plea deal. His testimony revealed the full network, how families across 3 states coordinated their control methods, shared techniques for avoiding detection, and pooled resources to silence victims. He named names, provided dates, and exposed the rehabilitation facilities as conversion camps designed to break resistance through starvation and isolation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. We waited in a small room, holding hands and barely speaking. When they called us back, the foreman stood with verdict in hand, guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit false imprisonment, child endangerment, witness tampering, obstruction of justice. The sentences would come later, but the convictions were secured. The courtroom erupted. Some families sobbed with relief while others shouted about injustice and persecution. The fathers were taken into custody immediately, bail revoked due to flight risk. My uncle's face as they led him away was something I'll never forget, disbelief mixed with rage that his control had finally ended. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us. Theodore spoke eloquently about the importance of believing survivors. My mother simply said she was ready to heal. Maya's aunt announced they were starting a foundation to help girls escape similar situations. The sentencing came 2 months later. The judge had reviewed everything: the testimonies, the evidence, the impact on dozens of young lives. She spoke about the particular cruelty of using basic needs like food as weapons of control. My uncle received 8 years. My father got 6. The others ranged from 3 to 7 years, depending on their level of involvement. The rehabilitation facilities were shut down, their operators facing separate charges. It wasn't everything we'd hoped for, but it was accountability.